Mike Tyson was 21 years old when he walked into the Regency Hotel's basement in Atlantic City, and in 12 seconds, two men who had survived war would learn the difference between trained violence and something much older. The year was 1987. Mike held every major heavyweight title. His face was on magazine covers. His name opened doors that stayed closed to most men. But down in that basement, beneath the chandeliers and marble floors where tourists took photographs, there existed a different world entirely. The illegal poker room wasn't on any hotel map. You reached it through a service corridor past the laundry, down concrete stairs that smelled like bleach and old water, through a steel door that had no handle on the outside. Inside, the ceiling hung low enough that tall men had to duck. Green-shaded lamps cast circles of light onto felt tables where men in loosened ties pushed chips across worn surfaces. Cigarette smoke hung in layers. The air conditioning rattled, but barely worked. You could hear it struggling against the heat of bodies and the weight of money changing hands. The walls sweated. Someone had tried to make it look classy once, putting up dark wood paneling, but the humidity had warped it. Now it just looked like what it was, a place where rules didn't apply. Mike wasn't there to gamble. He'd been drinking upstairs at the bar, trying to quiet something in his head that wouldn't stop moving. Cush D'Amato had died 2 years earlier. The man who'd taken a kid from Brownsville and turned him into something unstoppable was gone, and Mike was still trying to figure out how to be the champion without the only father he'd ever known, so he drank. And when someone mentioned the basement game, he followed because anywhere was better than sitting alone with his thoughts. He came down those stairs with his hands in his pockets, wearing a black shirt that stretched tight across his shoulders. Even casual, even half-drunk, he moved like something that didn't belong in regular spaces. His neck was thicker than most men's thighs. His presence changed the air pressure in rooms. The game stopped when he walked in. Not because anyone recognized him, though a few did. It stopped because that's what happens when a certain kind of energy enters a confined space. The dealer's hands froze mid-shuffle. A man counting chips lost his place. Someone coughed and it sounded too loud. Mike stood in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and that's when he saw them. Two men at the back table. Big men, both of them, though nobody looked big next to Mike. The older one had grey in his hair, and a scar that ran from his ear to his collar. The younger one had the build of someone who'd spent years carrying heavy equipment through hostile territory. They wore civilian clothes but sat with military posture, backs straight, eyes constantly scanning. Between them sat empty beer bottles, and a stack of chips that suggested they'd been winning. The older one looked at Mike and said something to his partner. They both laughed. It wasn't a friendly sound. Mike moved to the bar, a piece of plywood laid across 2 barrels in the corner. The bartender, a nervous man with sweat stains under his arms, poured him whiskey without being asked. Mike drank it in one pull. The burn felt good, real. It was something happening in his body instead of his head. Behind him, he heard the older soldier's voice, raised just loud enough to carry. Look at this guy, probably thinks he's tough. Mike's hand tightened on the empty glass. The bartender saw it and took a step back. All these city boys think they're tough, the younger soldier added. His voice had an edge to it, something sharp and looking for a place to cut. Gym muscles. Never been in a real fight in their lives. Mike set the glass down carefully. He could feel Cal's voice in his head, the old man's lessons about discipline, about not fighting outside the ring, about protecting what you'd built. But Cal's was dead, and these men didn't know who they were talking to, or maybe they did, and it didn't matter to them. You know what real violence looks like, the older one continued, his voice getting louder. Not that choreographed garbage on TV, real violence, the kind where you don't get to stop when a bell rings. The room had gone completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Mike turned around slowly. His face showed nothing. That was something Q's had taught him early. Never let them see what's coming. You talking to me? His voice came out flat, almost gentle. That was the most dangerous sound Mike Tyson could make. The older soldier stood up. He was maybe 6'2", probably weighed 220. All of it hard. Just making conversation, friend. No offense meant, but his smile said otherwise. His smile said he'd spent years in places where weakness got you killed, and he didn't see anything in this gym rat that scared him. The younger one stood too. He was bigger, maybe 6'3", heavier in the shoulders. We've just been drinking, watching these local boys play cards, wondering if anyone around here actually knows what a real fight looks like. He looked directly at Mike. "You ever been in a real fight, big man?" Mike took 3 steps forward. That was all the space the room allowed. Now they were close enough to smell each other's breath. Close enough that when violence came, there'd be no time to prepare. "I'm Mike Tyson." He said it simply, like he was telling them his address. The older soldier's smile widened. "I know who you are. I've seen you on TV, dancing around in your little shorts, hugging guys when the referee says so." He leaned in closer. "That ain't fighting. That's performing." Something shifted in Mike's eyes. Later, the bartender would tell people it was like watching a storm system move across a landscape. 1 second there was a person standing there. The next second there was something else. "We served in Panama," the younger soldier said, emboldened by his partner's confidence. "We've done things you couldn't imagine in your worst nightmares, so forgive us if we're not impressed by some boxer who..." He never finished the sentence. What happened next would be talked about in that basement for years. The story would spread through Atlantic City's underground, get embellished, exaggerated, but the people who were actually there would always insist that no exaggeration was necessary. What they saw was already beyond belief. Mike's right hand moved first. Not a punch, not yet, just a shift in position, his weight rolling forward onto his front foot. It took maybe a quarter of a second. In that fraction of time, 12 years of training activated, thousands of hours in the gym, with Kiss, learning how to turn his body into a weapon. Every morning running in the dark, every afternoon hitting the heavy bag until his hands bled, every evening watching film, studying angles, learning to see openings that existed for less than a heartbeat. The younger soldier saw the movement and his training kicked in too. His hands came up, military combative style, efficient and proven. In a bar fight against a civilian, it would have been more than enough. But this wasn't a bar fight, and Mike Tyson was not a civilian. The first punch came from somewhere the soldier's training hadn't prepared him for. Mike's left hook traveled maybe 8 inches. That was all the room it needed. It came up from below, rising through the soldier's guard like water finding a crack in concrete. The angle was perfect. The timing was flawless. The power behind it was something you had to experience to understand. The hook caught the soldier on the right side of his jaw, just below the ear. That's where the mandibular nerve runs close to the surface, where the jaw connects to the skull with nothing but soft tissue to protect it. When serious force hits that spot at the right angle, the brain doesn't have time to process what's happening, it just shuts down. The sound was distinctive. Not a movie punch sound, real, a collision of bone and flesh, and all the physics of violence concentrated into a point smaller than a quarter. The soldier's legs stopped working before his mind registered the punch. His eyes went empty, his hands still raised in guard position, slowly lowered. His knees buckled in a way that looked almost graceful, like a building during controlled demolition, each floor collapsing onto the one below. He hit the concrete floor, face first. His nose broke with an audible crack. Blood pooled immediately under his cheek. 3 seconds had passed. The older soldier's face changed. The confidence evaporated. In its place came something primal, the recognition of genuine danger. He'd seen men die. He'd killed men himself. He knew what real violence looked like, and he was looking at it now. But he'd also survived combat by never backing down, and that instinct overrode his common sense. He lunged forward, trying to use his size, trying to close the distance and turn it into a grapple where his military training might give him an advantage. His hands reached for Mike's throat. Mike's head moved 4 inches to the left. The soldier's hands grabbed air. The counter came instantly. To Mike's right hand, the one that had put away Trevor Berbick, that had destroyed James Smith, that had broken Larry Holmes's spirit, shot forward in a straight line. It traveled through the space where the soldier's defenses used to be, where they would have been if he hadn't overcommitted to the lunge. The punch hit him in the solar plexus, that cluster of nerves behind the sternum that controls the diaphragm. When it struck with enough force, every muscle involved in breathing spasms at once. You can't inhale, you can't exhale, you can't do anything but exist in that moment of airless panic. The soldier's mouth opened in a silent scream. His face turned red, then purple. His hands clutched at his chest, like he could manually restart his lungs. Mike wasn't finished. The left hook came around again, this time to the body, slamming into the soldier's liver on the right side. The liver is the largest internal organ. It has no bone protecting it. When trauma hits it, the vagus nerve triggers a parasympathetic shock that drops blood pressure instantly. Fighters call it the body's off switch. The soldier folded like paper. His face hit Mike's chest on the way down. He collapsed next to his partner, curled into a fetal position, making sounds that weren't quite human. 12 seconds had passed since Mike threw the first punch. The basement was absolutely silent. 20 men sat frozen at their tables, cards forgotten in their hands, chips scattered where they'd been dropped. The dealer stood with his mouth open, a single card held in the air. The bartender had pressed himself against the back wall, as far from the violence as the room allowed. Mike stood between the two fallen soldiers, breathing steady, not even winded. His hands hung at his sides, relaxed now. The storm had passed through him and left him calm in its wake. He looked down at the men on the floor. The younger one was unconscious, blood spreading slowly across the concrete from his broken nose. The older one was conscious but not functional, his body locked in spasm, his eyes wide with an animal understanding that he'd just encountered something completely outside his experience. Mike's voice, when he spoke, was quiet. "You were right about one thing. You've been in real fights." He looked at the older soldier's eyes, made sure the man could hear him through the pain. "But I've been fighting since I was 12 years old, every single day, and the difference between us." He paused, making sure the words would be remembered. "You learned to fight to survive. I learned to fight to destroy." He stepped over the bodies, walked to the bar, picked up the whiskey bottle, poured himself another drink. His hands were completely steady, not a tremor, not a scratch. He drank slowly, letting the moment settle. No one moved, no one spoke. They all understood they'd just witnessed something that belonged in a different era, something primitive and absolute. One of the gamblers, an older Italian man who'd seen his share of basement violence over the years, finally broke the silence. His voice came out hoarse, respectful, in a way that had nothing to do with celebrity and everything to do with genuine fear. "Jesus Christ, Mike, you could have killed them." Mike set the glass down. He looked at the man with eyes that had gone quiet again. The storm pulled back inside wherever it lived, when it wasn't being used. "No," he said simply. "If I wanted them dead, they'd be dead. I just wanted them to understand." He pulled out a roll of bills from his pocket, peeled off 500s, dropped them on the bar. "For the mess," he said to the bartender, who nodded rapidly, still pressed against the wall. Then Mike walked to the door. He had to step over the younger soldier's leg to reach it. He paused there, looked back at the room one last time. Somebody get them to a hospital. Then he was gone, back up the concrete stairs, through the service corridor, into the bright hotel lobby, where tourists took photographs, and nobody knew that 2 floors below them, 2 men who'd survived Panama were learning to breathe again. The story spread fast. By morning, everyone in Atlantic City's fight world had heard some version of it. By the next week, it had reached New York, Los Angeles, London. The details varied. Some said it was 3 soldiers. Some said Mike had used a chair. Some said the whole thing lasted 30 seconds. But the people who were actually there, the 20 witnesses in that basement, they always told it the same way. 12 seconds. 2 punches each. And a level of violence so controlled, so precise, so utterly beyond what they thought human beings were capable of, that it changed how they understood the word dangerous. The older soldier spent 3 days in the hospital, broken ribs, ruptured spleen, liver contusion. His military buddies visited, asked what happened, if he wanted to press charges. He told them no. When they asked why, he said something that became its own legend. "Because I finally met someone who's actually been to war every day of his life, and I don't ever want to go back to his war." The younger soldier recovered faster. Broken nose, concussion, fractured jaw. He left town as soon as he could walk. Years later, someone asked him about that night. He said, "I've been shot at. I've had grenades land near me. I've been in situations where I thought I was going to die. But I've never been as scared as I was when Mike Tyson looked at me and decided to teach me a lesson." Mike never talked about it publicly. When reporters asked him about basement fights, street fights, he'd shrug and say he didn't remember. But people close to him knew. They could see it in his eyes, sometimes, that knowledge of what he was capable of, what lived inside him that Koss had taught him to control, but never eliminate. Because that was the real lesson of that night in the basement. It wasn't about Mike's power. Everyone knew he was powerful. It wasn't about his speed. Everyone knew he was fast. It was about control, about a man who could access that level of violence, deploy it with surgical precision, and then turn it off like flipping a switch. That's what made him truly dangerous. Not the violence itself, but his absolute mastery over it. The poker game in that basement continued for another year before the police finally shut it down, but it was never the same after that night. There was a crack in the floor where the younger soldier's head had hit. The management tried to fix it, but it kept reappearing. Eventually, they just left it. People would point it out to newcomers, tell the story, watch their faces change as they understood what had happened in that room. And always, the question someone would eventually ask, what would have happened if Tyson hadn't held back? The old-timers who'd been there would just shake their heads, because that was the thing about Mike Tyson that the TV cameras never quite captured. The scariest thing about him wasn't what he did in the ring. It was knowing that in the ring against opponents who'd trained their whole lives to face him, he was following rules, using only a fraction of what he was capable of. Down in that basement for 12 seconds, the rules disappeared. And two men who thought they knew violence learned the difference between knowing about darkness and actually being born in it. Mike walked back to his hotel room that night, took a shower, sat on the bed in a towel, staring at his hands. They didn't hurt. They never hurt, no matter what he hit. Kumas had taught him that too. Proper technique meant you could hit concrete and walk away. He thought about calling someone, his mother maybe, tell her he'd handled something stupid, that he was okay. But it was late, and what would he say? That he'd almost killed two men in a basement for talking trash. That for 12 seconds, he'd let out the thing Kovs had spent years teaching him to cage. So he sat there in the dark, in a luxury hotel room that cost more than his mother's monthly rent, and felt the distance between where he was and where he'd come from. Felt the weight of being the youngest heavyweight champion in history. Felt the weight of being a weapon that everyone wanted to use or destroy, or both. Down in the basement, they were cleaning up blood. Up in his room, Mike Tyson sat in the dark and remembered being 13, when Q's first taught him how to hurt people, really hurt them. Not street fighting, not wild swinging, but controlled, scientific violence. You're going to be the best fighter in the world, Tumnus had told him, and that means you'll have power that most men never experience. That power will scare you sometimes, will make you wonder what you're capable of. And the answer, Michael, is anything. You're capable of anything. That's why you must never, ever lose control. In the basement, 12 seconds. In his room, 12 years of training. The math was simple. The consequences were not. Mike lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow he'd train. Day after that, he'd train. Day after that, another fight, another opponent, another night of controlled violence in front of cameras and crowds. But tonight, in that basement, for 12 seconds he'd shown two men what lived underneath all that control, and they would never forget it. Neither would he.